The Korean Mafia boss installed cameras in every room of his house to watch over his crippled twins. He never expected the chubby maid he hired out of desperation would be the one to tear the whole system down.
Houn froze in the hallway. Something had moved. Not a person, a lens.
A small black eye tucked into the corner of the ceiling molding had turned, ever so slightly, tracking her as she walked.
She stopped breathing for a second.
She told herself it was nothing.
Old houses creaked.
Old houses had shadows. But old houses did not have cameras that followed you like they were alive.
She didn't know she was being watched. She definitely didn't know why.
And in 3 days, she would find out that the answer to that question would change the rest of her life and the lives of 2 children who hadn't spoken a single word since the night their parents died.
Before we get into it,
if you're new here, welcome to Afro-k Storyhouse, where we bring you the kind of romance and crime drama that hits you right in the chest. Hit that subscribe button, drop a like, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight. Trust me, you don't want to miss where this story goes.
Let's get into it.
3 days earlier, Houn sat in a plastic chair outside an office in Gangnam, her resume folded in her lap because she'd been holding it so tight the paper had started to soften at the edges. She was 26. She had a business degree she couldn't use, a smile she'd trained herself to keep on no matter what, and a body that every interviewer's eyes seemed to catch on before they caught on anything else she'd written on that resume.
"We'll call you," the woman behind the desk said, the way people say it when they mean "we will never call you." Houn had heard that sentence so many times it didn't even hurt anymore.
It just sat in her chest like a stone she carried from one office to the next. She'd applied to 23 jobs in 4 months.
Retail, reception, customer service.
Every single one wanted someone who looked a certain way behind a desk, and Houn, with her round cheeks and her soft arms and her stomach that curved out instead of in, had learned that "we'll call you" was code for something she wasn't supposed to say out loud. She was walking home because she couldn't afford the bus that week when her phone buzzed.
An unknown number. She almost didn't answer. "Is this Houn?" a man's voice asked. Clipped. Businesslike. "Yes."
"You applied for a domestic position 3 weeks ago. Live-in maid, private residence.
The position is still open. Are you interested?" Houn blinked. She didn't remember applying to anything like that.
She'd applied to so many places she'd stopped keeping track, throwing her resume at anything that might catch her before she hit the ground completely.
Yes. Yes, I'm interested. The pay is 4 times the market rate. Room and board included. There are conditions." "What kind of conditions?" "You'll be told when you arrive." "Can you start Monday?"
4 times the market rate. Houn did the math in her head before she'd even finished the sentence.
That was rent paid off.
That was her mother's hospital bills, the ones that had been sitting in a drawer for 6 months growing interest like a slow, quiet monster.
That was air conditioning in the summer instead of a wet towel on her neck. "Yes," she said. "I can start Monday." "Good.
A car will collect you at 9 a.m. or something you don't mind never getting back." The call ended before she could ask what that meant.
She should have asked more questions. She knew that later, looking back. But desperation doesn't ask questions.
Desperation just says yes and hopes the roof doesn't fall in until after rent is paid. The house sat behind a gate so tall Houn couldn't see over it from the car, and when it swung open, she understood immediately that she had entered a different world entirely. The building looked less like a home and more like something built to keep people out: smooth stone, dark windows, security cameras mounted at every corner like unblinking sentries standing guard over nothing she could see.
A man in a black suit met her at the door. He didn't smile. "You'll address the head of household as Mr. Kong.
You do not initiate conversation with him unless spoken to first.
You do not enter the East Wing without permission. You do not touch the equipment in the control room. Do you understand these rules?"
"Yes," Houn said, even though she understood almost nothing at all. "The children are Kong Minjun and Kong Seo-yoon.
Twins, age 9. They have not spoken since the accident 8 months ago. You are not a therapist. You are not a nurse. You are staff. Keep it professional.
Hound nodded, but something in her chest already resisted that word.
Keep it professional. As if children who hadn't spoken in 8 months needed professionalism. As if grief could be handled with a clipboard and a schedule.
She was led down a long hallway lined with photographs that had all been turned to face the wall, as if someone couldn't stand to look at the faces in them anymore. And that was when she saw it, the lens in the ceiling corner, swiveling to follow her.
Is that, she started.
Don't ask about the cameras, the man in the suit said, his voice flat and final.
That's rule number 1. The most important one.
Hound met the twins in a sunroom at the back of the house, all glass and pale light, and yet somehow colder than any room she'd ever stood in. 2 wheelchairs sat side by side, facing a window that looked out onto a garden nobody used. Min-jun had his father's jaw, sharp even at 9 years old, and eyes that refused to land on anything for more than a second. Seo-yoon sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap like she was waiting for a train that was never going to come. This is Houn, the housekeeper who trained her, an older woman named Mrs. O, said gently. She'll be helping take care of you now. Neither twin looked up. Mrs. O sighed, the kind of sigh that had years of failed attempts folded into it.
They don't respond. Doctors say it's selective mutism, trauma-related. Feed them, bathe them, dress them, keep them safe. Don't expect conversation. Don't take it personally.
Houn crouched down so she was at eye level with Seo-yoon instead of towering over her the way every adult in this house probably did. Hi, she said softly. I like your hair clip.
Did you pick it out yourself? Silence.
I used to have one just like it when I was your age. Except mine had a chip in it because I dropped it in the kitchen sink like 100 times. Houn smiled, easy, unbothered by the silence, the way you'd talk to a cat that hadn't decided to trust you yet.
I'm not going anywhere. So whenever you feel like talking, I'll be around.
Mrs. O pulled her aside once they'd left the sunroom.
Don't do that. Do what?
Get close. The last 3 maids who worked here got close, and it ended badly for everyone.
This family isn't like other families you've worked for. There are things happening in this house that are bigger than you and me. Do your job. Keep your head down. Collect your pay. Leave when your contract's up.
Houn wanted to ask what bigger than you and me meant. She wanted to ask why every hallway had a camera in it, why the photographs faced the wall, why a 9-year-old girl sat so still she looked like she was posing for a painting nobody would ever finish. But she also needed this job more than she needed answers, so she swallowed the questions down and nodded instead. That night, alone in the small staff room they'd given her, Houn lay awake staring at the ceiling, checking, for the first time in her life, whether there was a camera in her own room.
There wasn't. Small comfort.
But somewhere in this house, a lens had watched her the moment she walked in, and she couldn't shake the feeling that whoever sat behind those cameras was watching her right now, deciding whether she was worth keeping. If you're feeling this story already, make sure you smash that subscribe button so you don't miss the next upload, and drop a comment telling me who you think is really behind those cameras.
I read every single one of them. Now, back to the story. For the first week, Houn didn't see Mr. Kong at all.
She heard about him. In fragments, in the careful way the other staff lowered their voices whenever his name came up, in the way the guards at the gate straightened their spines if a black car pulled in unannounced. Kong Tae-jun, 34 years old. Head of the Kong family since his older brother died in the same crash that had taken the twins' voices and left them unable to walk. Nobody used the word mafia out loud, but everyone in the house moved like they were standing near something that could go off if handled wrong.
Houn settled into a rhythm anyway. She woke the twins, dressed them, wheeled them down to breakfast, and talked to them the entire time.
About the weather, about a dog she'd seen on her walk to the market, about nothing at all, really, just filling the silence with warmth instead of letting it sit there cold and heavy the way it clearly had for 8 months. On day 4, she caught Min-jun watching her instead of the window. On day 6, she was brushing Seo-yoon's hair when the girl's hand twitched toward the ribbon on the dresser, reaching for it without being asked. It was such a small thing.
Haun almost missed it.
But she didn't, and when she handed Seo-yoon the ribbon, the girl's fingers closed around it like she was holding onto something more than fabric. "There you go," Haun whispered, her throat suddenly tight.
"See? You know exactly what you want. You don't need words for that."
She didn't notice, in that moment, that a camera in the corner of the room had zoomed in, its lens adjusting silently, capturing every second of it for someone sitting 3 floors away in a room with no windows and 6 screens glowing in the dark. Taejun had installed the cameras 8 months ago, the week after the funeral, the week the doctors told him his niece and nephew might never walk or speak again. He told himself it was for their safety.
Rival families circling, old debts still owed, a house full of enemies who wouldn't think twice about using 2 orphan children as leverage. That part was true.
But it wasn't the whole truth, and some nights, sitting alone in that room with 6 screens glowing blue against his face, he let himself admit the rest of it.
He watched because he couldn't be in the room.
Every time he looked at Minjun's face, he saw his brother. Every time Seo-yoon turned her head a certain way, he saw his sister-in-law, laughing at something at a dinner table that didn't exist anymore. He watched them from a safe distance because up close, the grief had teeth, and he'd built an empire out of never letting anything have teeth against him.
Except this.
He'd fired the last maid for getting too close. The one before that, he'd fired for not being close enough, for treating the twins like tasks on a checklist instead of children who'd lost everything.
He didn't know what he wanted.
He just knew he couldn't do it himself.
And then this new one arrived.
Round-faced, warm-voiced, talking to 2 silent children like they could hear every word and understand every joke, even when they gave nothing back. He told himself he was watching her the way he watched everyone. For security, for competence, for reasons that had nothing to do with the way something in his chest loosened slightly every time she made Seo-yoon's fingers twitch toward a ribbon. He told himself a lot of things in that room.
Most of them weren't true. It happened by accident.
Haun was looking for a spare blanket for Minjun, who'd started sleeping worse the past 2 nights, tossing in a way that made her worry about nightmares he had no words to describe. She opened a door she thought was a linen closet and instead found 6 screens glowing in a windowless room, each one showing a different part of the house: the twins' bedroom, the kitchen, the hallway outside her own staff room, the garden nobody walked in. Her own face was on one of the screens.
From an hour ago. Brushing Seo-yoon's hair. Her stomach dropped straight through the floor. "You shouldn't be in here." She spun around. A man stood in the doorway.
Tall, sharp-jawed, the same face she'd seen in the photograph of Minjun she'd been trying to piece together for a week, except older, harder, carved by something she couldn't name yet.
Kang Taejun.
In the flesh, finally, and nothing like the ghost the staff had made him sound like. "You're watching them," Haun said, her voice shaking with something that was equal parts fear and fury.
"You're watching me. Every room. Every second. It's for their protection." Protection?
She stepped closer, forgetting every rule Mrs. O had drilled into her about keeping her head down. You watch a 9-year-old girl brush her hair from a screen in a room with no windows instead of being there.
That's not protection. That's a man hiding.
Something flickered across his face, not anger, not exactly.
Something closer to being caught. You don't understand what this family is. What's outside that gate?
Every enemy I've ever made is waiting for one crack in this house to walk through it. So you built a bigger crack instead. Haun's hands were shaking now, but she didn't stop. Those kids haven't spoken in 8 months.
Do you know what they need? They don't need 6 cameras.
They need one person in the room with them who isn't afraid to look them in the eye.
You have no idea what
I don't care what you've done. I care what you're not doing. She was breathing hard now, past the point of caution, past the point of remembering this man could enter employment with a single word to his security team.
You're their uncle. Not their warden. For a long moment, neither of them said anything.
The 6 screens glowed between them, silent witnesses to a conversation that was about to change everything, though neither of them knew it yet. Get out of this room, Taejun finally said, his voice low and controlled in a way that was somehow more frightening than shouting would have been.
And don't ever come in here again. Haun laughed. But she didn't back down. Not really. Something had cracked open in that room, and it wasn't going to close again just because he'd told her to leave. She thought about quitting that night. She thought about it hard, lying awake in her narrow bed, running the numbers again, the hospital bills, the rent, her mother's face the last time Haun had visited, thinner than it should have been, saying don't worry about me, focus on yourself, and the exhausted voice of a woman who needed to be worried about. Haun couldn't quit. Not yet. Not with that math staring back at her. So instead, she decided to fight the only way she knew how. The next morning, she wheeled Min-jun and Seo-yoon into the sunroom, and instead of talking only to them, she looked directly up at the camera mounted in the corner and started talking to it. "Good morning," she said, loud and clear, like she was speaking to a person sitting right there in the room. "In case you're watching, and I know you are, Min-jun didn't sleep well again last night. He needs someone to sit with him before bed, not just a blanket. Kids don't need blankets when they're scared. They need a voice in the room." She turned to the next camera, in the hallway, as she wheeled the twins toward breakfast. Seo-yoon reached for her ribbon again this morning. On her own. That's the third time this week. Did you know that? Are you even watching closely enough to notice, or are you just watching to make sure nobody hurts them? The staff exchanged nervous glances. Mrs. O pulled her aside in the kitchen, hissing under her breath. "What are you doing? He'll fire you. He'll fire all of us if he thinks you're being insolent." "Let him fire me," Han said, though her heart was pounding so hard she was sure the whole kitchen could hear it. "Somebody needs to say it to his face or to whatever screen he's hiding behind." She kept it up for a week. Talking to the cameras like she was talking to Taejun directly, daring him, needling him, telling him exactly what his niece and nephew needed and exactly how far short he was falling. You want to protect them? Protection isn't a lock on a door. It's showing up. It's being in the room when they're scared, not 3 floors away behind a screen. Min-jun laughed today. Did you see it? A real laugh, not just air through his nose. He laughed because I fell over trying to teach him how wheelchair races work, and I looked ridiculous, and for 1 second he forgot he was sad. When was the last time you made him laugh? She didn't know if he was watching. She didn't know if any of it landed. But she said it anyway, every single day, because somebody in this house needed to say the truth out loud, even to a lens with no face behind it. Taejun told himself he'd stop watching her feed. He told himself for 4 days straight, and for 4 days straight, he sat in that windowless room until 2 in the morning, watching footage of a woman who talked to security cameras like they owed her an argument. On the 5th night, he watched something that broke something loose in his chest. Haun didn't know the camera in the twins' bedroom caught audio too. Nobody had told her that particular detail, and so she didn't know that when she sat on the edge of Min-jun's bed after the boy had finally drifted off, and let out a long, shaking breath, and pressed the heel of her hand against her eyes to stop herself from crying, that Taejun was watching every second of it from 3 floors away. "I'm sorry," she whispered to a sleeping boy who couldn't hear her. "I'm sorry nobody's here for you the way you deserve. I'm trying. I promise I'm trying." She wiped her face fast, like she was embarrassed even though no one was in the room, and pulled the blanket up over Min-jun's shoulders with a gentleness that made something in Taejun's throat close up entirely. He'd hired 6 maids in 8 months. Every single one of them had treated the twins like a job. This one cried alone in a dark room over children that weren't even hers, and then got up the next morning and did it all again, cheerful, warm, relentless. He found himself leaving the control room earlier the next night. Just to stand outside the twins' door. Just to listen. He didn't go in. Not yet. But it was the first step out of that dark room in 8 months, and some part of him, the part that still remembered being a person instead of a boss, a brother instead of a warlord, knew exactly whose fault that was. 2 weeks in, Haun did something that would have gotten any other maid fired on the spot. She turned on music in the sunroom, an old trot song her grandmother used to play, and started dancing badly, arms flailing, hips swaying off beat, making herself look as ridiculous as humanly possible. "Come on," she said to Min-jun, spinning his wheelchair in a slow, careful circle in time with the music. "You're the DJ. Tell me if I'm doing this wrong. I know I am. I can feel it.
She kept spinning him, kept making herself look foolish, kept narrating the whole thing like a sports commentator, and Minjun watches in horror as his caretaker demonstrates the worst dance moves in Korean history. Folks, truly a disaster unfolding live until she caught it.
The corner of his mouth. Pulling up. Just slightly. Not quite a smile.
But close enough to break her heart wide open. There it is, she whispered, stopping to spin, crouching down in front of him.
There's my boy. I saw that.
Minjun looked away, embarrassed, but the corner of his mouth stayed lifted for a few more seconds before it faded. 3 floors up, in a room with no windows, Kang Tae-jun sat with his hand pressed over his mouth, watching his nephew almost smile for the first time in 8 months, and felt something crack straight down the middle of his chest. He left the control room.
He didn't plan to.
His legs just moved before his mind caught up, carrying him down 3 flights of stairs and through hallways he hadn't walked in months, until he was standing in the doorway of the sunroom, watching Haun spin his nephew's wheelchair in slow circles while his niece watched from the side, her small hands folded in her lap, her eyes, for the first time in 8 months, not empty, but present.
Haun spotted him first.
She froze mid-spin, hands still on the wheelchair, breath caught somewhere in her throat.
"Mr. Kong," she said carefully.
"Don't stop," he said. His voice came out rougher than he meant it to.
"Please. Don't stop because of me."
For a moment, nobody moved. Then Haun, cautiously, started the music again and started spinning Minjun's chair, slower this time, watching Tae-jun out of the corner of her eye as he stepped further into the room.
Not to the screens, not to the control room, but into the actual space where his family was breathing and laughing and, however faintly, coming back to life. He didn't dance. He wasn't ready for that yet.
But he sat down in the chair by the window, the one that had been empty for 8 months, and he watched his niece and nephew with his own eyes instead of through a lens, and something about the room felt different because of it. Lighter. Realer. Haun caught his eye once, just once, across the room, and neither of them looked away as fast as professional distance would have required.
The peace didn't last.
It never does, not in this world. 3 days after the sunroom, a black car that didn't belong to the Kong family idled outside the gate for 11 minutes before driving off. Tae-jun watched the footage twice, his jaw tight, before calling his head of security into his office and closing the door.
"The Cho family," his security chief said grimly.
"They've been probing our perimeter for 2 weeks.
They know Tae-jun's been distracted.
They know the house has been different."
"Different how?"
"Softer. Word gets around, sir. A boss who leaves his control room to watch his niece dance is a boss people think they can move against." Tae-jun's hands curled into fists on the desk. He'd built walls around this house, literal and otherwise. Specifically so that nothing from his world could ever touch the twins again. And now, because he'd let himself feel something for the first time in 8 months, that wall was showing cracks. "Increase the perimeter guard," he said.
"Nobody in or out without clearance.
And get Haun and the twins moved to the safe room if anything happens."
"Anything at all? And if it's already too late for that?" Tae-jun didn't answer. He didn't have one.
It happened 2 nights later, fast and loud and nothing like the movies made it look. Haun was reading to the twins before bed a story about a fox who lost his voice and found it again in the most unexpected place, a story she'd chosen deliberately, hoping some small part of them would hear themselves in it. When the first gunshot cracked outside, followed by shouting, followed by the sound of the front gate being forced. "Get down," she said instantly, her body moving before her mind caught up, pulling both wheelchairs away from the window, pressing herself between the twins and the door.
"Stay with me. Stay right here with me, okay? I've got you. I've got you both."
Minjun's hands gripped the arms of his wheelchair so hard his knuckles went white. Seo-yoon's breathing had gone fast and shallow, panic rising in her chest with nowhere for it to go, no words to let it out.
Downstairs, chaos had broken loose.
Men Haun didn't recognize armed, moving with brutal efficiency, had breached the outer perimeter, cutting through security like it was paper.
Somewhere in the house, alarms were screaming.
Somewhere closer, Footsteps were pounding up the stairs, too fast, too many, heading directly toward the room where Haun crouched between two terrified children and a locked door that suddenly felt like tissue paper. "They're coming," she whispered, more to herself than to the twins, her heart slamming against her ribs. "They're coming and I don't know what to do." She'd never needed anyone the way she needed someone right now. 3 floors down, Taejun heard the alarms and didn't hesitate. For 8 months, every instinct in his body had told him to retreat to the control room, to watch from a safe distance, to let his men handle whatever threat came through that gate. But this time, his legs carried him the opposite direction, straight up the stairs, straight toward the room where his family was, gun drawn, heart pounding louder than the alarms, moving toward danger instead of away from it for the first time since the crash that had taken his brother. If your heart is racing right now, drop a comment and let me know, and if you haven't already, this is the perfect moment to hit subscribe, because trust me, it only gets more intense from here. The door burst open just as Taejun reached the top of the stairs. 2 men in dark clothing, weapons raised, stepped into the hallway ahead of him, and for one suspended second, everything in the world went completely silent. Then it didn't. Taejun moved the way he'd been trained to move before he'd ever built a control room to hide inside of, before grief had taught him it was safer to watch than to act. He put himself between the intruders and the door to the twins' room, and the fight that followed was fast and brutal and entirely without mercy. He'd spent 8 months behind screens, but his body remembered exactly what to do when the people he loved were on the other side of a door someone was trying to break down. Inside the room, Haun heard every second of it, the shouting, the struggle, a sound like a body hitting the wall hard enough to crack plaster, and she held the twins tighter, pressing her lips to the top of Seo-yoon's head, whispering the only thing she had left to give them. "He's here," she said, though she had no way of knowing for certain, only hope fierce enough to sound like fact. "Your uncle's here. He's not watching from a screen this time. He's right outside that door, and he is not going to let anything happen to you. I promise. I promise, I promise, I promise." The door burst open. Taejun stood in the frame, breathing hard, blood on his knuckles, a gun still gripped in one shaking hand, and for one terrible second Haun thought the worst had happened, that this was one of them, until his eyes found hers, found the twins pressed against her, and every hard line in his face broke open with something that looked almost like relief strong enough to buckle his knees. "Are they hurt?" His voice cracked on the question. "Haun. Are they hurt?" "They're okay," she said, her own voice shaking now that the danger had a face she recognized. "We're okay. You came. You actually came." He crossed the room in 3 strides and dropped to his knees in front of the wheelchairs, his hands hovering over his niece and nephew like he was afraid touching them would prove this wasn't real. "I'm here," he said, and his voice broke completely on the words, 8 months of distance collapsing in a single sentence. "I'm here. I'm so sorry I wasn't here before. I'm here now." That was when Seo-yoon screamed. It wasn't a scream of fear. It came from somewhere deeper than that, somewhere that had been sealed shut for 8 silent months, cracking open all at once under the pressure of an entire family finally in the same room together. She screamed a name, not a wordless sound, not a whimper, but an actual name, clear and raw and impossible. "Haun." The room went absolutely still. Haun's knees gave out. She sank to the floor in front of Seo-yoon's wheelchair, tears streaming down her face, her hands cupping the little girl's face like she was holding something too precious and too fragile to believe was real. "You spoke," she whispered. "Sweetheart, you spoke. You said my name. You said my name." Seo-yoon's face crumpled, and the tears that followed weren't the silent, controlled kind that had marked every day of the past 8 months. They were loud and messy and entirely, wonderfully alive. "You came back," Seo-yoon sobbed, the words rusty and unpracticed but unmistakably, gloriously hers. You came back, don't leave, don't leave." "I'm not going anywhere," Haun promised, pulling the little girl into her arms as best she could around the wheelchair, holding her the way she should have been held every single day for 8 months. "I'm not going anywhere, I promise you. I'm right here." Across the room, Minjun watched his sister speak for the first time in 8 months, and something in his own throat loosened too, a sound escaping him that wasn't quite words yet but was so much closer than silence. Taejun knelt between his niece and nephew, one hand on each of their shoulders, tears he hadn't let himself cry since the funeral finally spilling over, and for the first time since the crash, the room didn't feel cold at all. The house was quiet again by morning, the intruders driven off or worse, the security team doubling the perimeter, the immediate danger over even if the aftermath would take much longer to settle. Hoon sat on the back porch as the sun came up, too wired to sleep, wrapped in a blanket someone had draped over her shoulders sometime in the chaos of the last few hours. Taejun found her there, 2 cups of tea in his hands, his knuckles bandaged, his face still pale from a night that had cracked him open in more ways than one. "May I sit?" he asked. Which was, Hoon thought, the first time he'd asked her permission for anything since she'd walked through that gate 3 weeks ago. "It's your porch. It's your morning too." He sat, handing her one of the cups, and for a long moment neither of them said anything, watching the sun climb over the garden nobody used to walk in. "I owe you an explanation," he finally said. "About the cameras." Hoon waited. "After the crash, I told myself I installed them for security. Rival families, old enemies, the world I've built around this family, that part is real. That danger is real, and last night proved it." He turned the cup slowly in his hands. "But that wasn't the whole reason. The truth is, I couldn't look at them. Every time I looked at Minjun, I saw my brother's face, and I couldn't stand it. Every time Seo Yoon turned her head a certain way, I saw my sister-in-law, and the grief was, it had teeth. I've spent my whole life being someone nothing could touch. And grief touched me anyway, and I didn't know how to survive it except from a distance. So you watched instead of grieved." "I watched instead of showed up." He looked at her then, really looked, in a way that made her chest tighten. "You walked into this house 3 weeks ago and did the one thing every therapist, every specialist, every well-meaning person who touched this family in 8 months failed to do. You just showed up. Every single day. Even when it cost you something. Even when I told you not to get close." "They needed someone to get close," Hoon said quietly. "Grief doesn't heal from a distance." "I know that better than most people. Tell me." She hesitated, then let herself, for the first time since she'd arrived at this house. "My father left when I was 12. My mother worked 3 jobs and came home too exhausted to talk most nights, and I spent years thinking I had to earn attention by being useful, by being quiet, by not needing anything from anyone. I got good at taking care of people because nobody ever really took care of me first." She looked down at the tea in her hands. "When I saw those cameras, when I understood what they meant, a man who loved his family so much he couldn't stand to be near them, I recognized it. Because I spent years doing the same thing, just without the screens. Loving people from behind a wall because the wall felt safer than the risk of losing them up close." Taejun was quiet for a long moment. "I'm dismantling the system," he said finally. "Today. All of it. Every camera in this house, gone by tonight." Hoon looked up, startled. "What about the danger?" Last night proved something to me that 8 months of watching never could. The cameras didn't stop what happened last night. I did. Being in the room, being present, being willing to move toward the people I love instead of watching them from a safe distance, that's what protected this family. Not screens. Not distance. Presence." He set his cup down. "I'll increase the physical security. More guards, better perimeter systems, real protection instead of surveillance dressed up as protection. But I'm done watching my family live their lives through a lens. I want to be in the room. Every room. For the rest of however long they'll have me." Before we finish the story, if you haven't hit subscribe yet, now's the time. We've got so many more stories like this one coming, and you don't want to miss what's next. Drop a comment telling me what part of this story hit you the hardest. Now, let's bring it home. It took the better part of the day. Hoon watched from the hallway as the security team unbolted camera after camera from the ceiling of every room in that enormous cold house, the twins' bedroom, the kitchen, the hallway outside her own staff room, the sunroom where a boy had almost smiled and a girl had reached for a ribbon on her own for the first time in 8 months. Each one came down like a small funeral, a piece of the wall Taejun had built around himself dismantled bolt by bolt, screw by screw, until the last one, the one in the corner of the hallway that had first caught Hound's attention on her very first day, came free in the security chief's hands. Taejun stood in the control room himself as the 6 screens were disconnected, unplugged, carried out one by one, until the room that had held 8 months of his life stood empty and darkened, for the first time since the funeral, completely silent. Stood there a long moment, looking at the blank walls where the screens had been, and Hound, watching from the doorway, understood that this wasn't just a room being emptied. It was a man finally putting down something he'd been carrying alone for far too long. "Come on," she said softly, holding out her hand, a gesture that crossed every single line Mrs. O had warned her about on day one, and neither of them cared anymore. "There's somewhere better to be than in here." Taejun looked at her hand, then at her face, and something settled in his eyes that hadn't been there in 8 months, something that looked almost like peace. He took it. That evening, for the first time since the crash that had shattered this family 8 months earlier, dinner was served at the long dining table instead of trays brought to separate rooms. Minjun sat at one end, still in his wheelchair but leaning forward, engaged, watching everything with the sharp, curious eyes of a boy who was slowly, carefully coming back to life. Seo-yoon sat beside him, and though her voice was still rusty, still finding its footing after 8 months of silence, she used it. Asking for more rice, correcting Minjun when he reached for the wrong side dish, laughing, actually laughing, at something so small Hound couldn't even remember what it was later, only the sound of it, bright and startling and utterly perfect. Taejun sat at the head of the table where his brother used to sit, and for the first time, the chair didn't look like a wound. It looked like a seat being filled by someone who'd finally decided to stay in it. Hound sat across from him, watching the family she'd walked into 3 weeks ago as a stranger desperate for a paycheck slowly reassemble itself into something whole. There were no cameras watching this moment. No lens capturing it for someone to relive later from a safe distance. Just 4 people, at one table, present with each other in a way that felt more valuable than every security system money could buy. After dinner, once the twins had been settled. Minjun, already half asleep from a day that had asked more of him emotionally than his small body was used to, Seo-yoon still humming quietly to herself, testing out the sound of her own voice like she couldn't quite believe it was hers to use again. Taejun walked Hound out to the porch where they'd sat that morning. "I have to ask you something," he said, and for a man who ran an empire other men feared, he suddenly looked nervous in a way she'd never seen on him before. "Ask." "Your contract was for 6 months. I know you took this job because you needed the money, not because you wanted to stay in a house full of danger and dysfunction." He paused. "I'm asking you to stay anyway. Not as staff. Not because of a contract or a paycheck, though I'll pay you whatever you need, your mother's care, whatever it takes, that's not a question anymore. I'm asking you to stay because this family, because I don't know how to go back to who we were before you walked through that gate. And I don't want to." Hound's chest ached with something warm and terrifying all at once. "Taejun." "I know what I am," he said quickly, before she could finish. "I know the world I come from, the danger that follows a family like mine, the fact that I told you not to get close and you did it anyway, and it turned out to be the only right decision anyone in this house has made in 8 months. I'm not asking you to fix me. I'm asking you to stay in the room with me. That's all. Just stay in the room." Hound looked at him for a long moment. This man who'd hidden behind screens because grief had teeth, who'd finally walked toward danger instead of away from it when it mattered most, who was standing in front of her now with nothing between them at all, no lens, no distance, no wall. "I already decided that," she said softly, "the moment your niece screamed my name instead of nobody's. I'm not going anywhere." He didn't kiss her that night. It wasn't the moment for that yet, not with the wounds still so fresh, not with a family still learning how to breathe again after 8 months underwater. But he reached across the space between them and took her hand, the same way he had in that empty control room hours earlier, and this time neither of them let go for a long, long time. The garden that nobody used to walk in was full of life by the time 6 weeks had passed. Minjun's wheelchair rolling along the stone path. Taejun had widened himself with his own hands over a weekend, insisting on doing the work rather than hiring it out, needing to build something with those hands instead of just protecting things with them. Seo-yoon's voice had grown stronger every day, still occasionally catching on certain words the way a muscle catches after being in use too long, but at present, hers, growing louder and freer with every week that passed. The rival threat that had breached the house that night had been dealt with thoroughly, permanently, in ways that belonged to Taejun's world and not to this story, and the physical security around the estate had been rebuilt from the ground up, real guards, real perimeter systems, real protection instead of the hollow surveillance that had stood in for it before. But inside the house itself, there wasn't a single camera left. Not one lens. Not one screen. Just rooms full of people who showed up for each other in person, every single day, because a chubby maid with nothing left to lose had walked into a cold house and refused to let the silence win. Haun still worked in that house, though worked had started to feel like the wrong word for what she did there. She made breakfast for 2 children who talked her ear off now instead of sitting in silence. She still danced badly in the sunroom on lazy afternoons. She still sat with Minjun when the nightmares came, only now Taejun sat there too, on the other side of the bed, present instead of 3 floors away. On a quiet evening in early autumn, the whole family sat together in that same sunroom, the twins working on homework at a low table, Haun curled into the chair by the window that used to sit empty, Taejun beside her, his arm around her shoulders in a way that had become as natural as breathing. There were no cameras watching this moment. There was no lens capturing it for later, no screen glowing somewhere in a dark room 3 floors away. There was only the moment itself. Full, warm, and entirely, permanently theirs. Minjun looked up from his homework and grinned at his uncle. "Are you going to marry her?" Seoyun burst out laughing before Taejun could even respond, and Haun felt her whole face go red, and Taejun, the same man who had once run this entire family from behind 6 glowing screens, too afraid to be in the room with the people he loved, just laughed too, warm and unguarded, and pulled Haun a little closer against his side. "Working on it," he said. And for the first time in a very long time, in a house that used to be cold and watched and silent, the answer to that question didn't feel like something anyone needed to be afraid of anymore. It felt like something that had already, quietly, become true. That's the story, everyone. From a house full of cameras and silence to a family finally learning how to be present with each other. I hope this one hit you the way it hit me while writing it. If you love this story, make sure you hit that subscribe button so you never miss the next one. Drop a like if you're glad Taejun finally left that control room, and let me know in the comments which moment made you tear up the most. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.